And the frustrating thing for me early on, Dwight, and when I got into speaking was I felt like I was building sandcastles. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Like I would do all this work, I would create this presentation, I would go and present it, I would stand back. I'm like, that's exactly what I wanted. And I would admire the work. I'd be like, I like that a lot.
Welcome to Give a Heck. I am your host, Dwight Heck, and for much of my life, lived my life in quiet desperation, wondering how I was going to pay the bills, take vacations, save for retirement, and one day wondering if I would get off the hamster wheel of life and have purpose. A life that most of society lives, which takes us to work, then home, then repeat, and pays us hopefully enough just to survive. The harsh truth that most live with more month than money and have no idea how to live life on purpose, not by accident. This ensures the mass majority are living not just financially broke, however emotionally and mentally as well due to financial pressures. In each episode, I will introduce you to thoughts, ideas, and guests that can help you to learn how you too can live life on purpose, not by accident. Good day and welcome to Give a Heck. On today's show, I welcome Scott Harvey. Scott, after 20 years in law enforcement as a hostage negotiator and over 10 years owning his own company, learned a lot about what makes people successful, from supervising officers as their sergeant to teaching thousands of DARE classes and speaking professionally to hundreds of thousands of people. Scott has honed his ability to teach these leadership skills to others, and he steps on dozens of stages each year, passing on what he has learned. Through his business coaching and mastermind, Scott also gets the opportunity to sit down face-to-face with entrepreneurs and business leaders, challenging them to grow their businesses without sacrificing their family or their health. I'd like to welcome you to the show, Scott. Thanks so much for agreeing to come on and share with us some of your life journey.
Thanks so much. I'm super excited to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. For the listeners, I actually heard Scott get interviewed by Tony Watley, as many of you are familiar with, because Tony comes up in conversations, has been on the show as well. And I was fanboying a little bit on Scott and Tony's podcast episode because it was so good. It was just very personable. There was a lot of great information. And I figured, you know what? Let's give a heck and bring you to my listeners. So I appreciate you being on, brother. It's an honor.
Love it.
So Scott, one of the things I talked about before we hit record was the fact that I focus on the origin story. My loyal listeners know I do. It's based on the fact of how do people get to know, like, and trust. It's when we are willing to share and be vulnerable. And you can share whatever you'd like, but I'd like you to share from your earliest recollections to where you are today in your life, if you would, please.
Yeah, I was born in Richmond, Indiana, just a little bit south or a little bit northwest of where I live today. And when I was about 3 years old, we moved to the Dayton, Ohio area. And Dayton is what I call home. That's where I lived from 3 years of age until I went off to go to college. I graduated from a high school right outside of Dayton. It was a suburb of Dayton. And so that's kind of where home is. Early on, my parents divorced when I was about 8 years old. Had a 10-year-old brother and a little brother on the way, which was kind of the straw that broke the parents' marriage. They didn't plan on a third kid. Third kid came along and dad was just out. So childhood shaped by that, growing up without a dad in the home and all of the things that brought with it. I graduated high school without getting arrested, which, with my track record is probably really saying something. I had every reason to be a victim, chose not to be. And I went to Kentucky to go to college from Dayton, Ohio. I went to Eastern Kentucky University, which is in Richmond, Kentucky, just south of Lexington. And I tell you, Dwight, once I got in Kentucky, there was nothing going to pull me back out of it. I love living here. This is where I live today, all these years later. And once I got settled down here, my mom and my little brother moved down here. A few years later, my older brother moved down here. So the only family I still have up in the Dayton, Ohio area is my dad and his new wife. And I go up there occasionally to visit with them. He comes down here more because, let's be honest, Dwight, if you were choosing between visiting Ohio and visiting Kentucky, you're going to visit Kentucky every time. It's just a better place to be, right? So they come down here quite a bit. And that's kind of me in a nutshell. I went to college to study police administration because from a young age, I always knew I wanted to be a police officer. Now, it doesn't require a college degree here in Kentucky to be a police officer, but you do have to be 21. And so you graduate high school at 18, you've got 3 years before you can become a police officer. I went ahead and got a degree. And with that degree, I minored in Spanish, and that's something that I used quite a bit in my job. We have a large migrant worker population here in central Kentucky, and I was able to help them a lot because between my limited Spanish and their limited English, we could usually communicate effectively to get our points across to each other. So worked at the police department for 20 years. Was about 3 years into my police career when I decided that I didn't really like cleanup. Policing is a lot of cleanup, meaning the tragedy has occurred, so we call the police. The wreck has happened, the murder has happened, the assault has happened. The police come in and just try to clean things back up again. And you just can't do that, right? You can only load so many people into body bags. You can only give parents and family bad news so many times before I personally wanted to get upstream of the problem. So a DARE position became available, and I thought if I can teach students how to make better choices, then we don't have to do some of the things we've been doing, is kind of what I thought. I got involved in DARE. And about the same time, I got involved as a hostage negotiator. I went through training with the FBI and did all of my subsequent negotiator training through the FBI around the country, because I'm not one, Dwight, who even when I was on patrol, I didn't want to get in a fight. I still don't like to fight. I'm perfectly capable of defending myself or other people, but I would much rather talk you out of it. And the hostage negotiator was basically talking people out of making their bad situation worse. And so I got involved in that as a way to kind of help people who are at the end of their rope, because we call them hostage negotiators, but in truth, they're crisis negotiators, because there may or may not be a hostage. It may just be a suicidal, barricaded individual who's wanting to kill themselves, but may not want to, so the police get involved. And that's where I got involved in DARE and in hostage negotiation. And in those areas, it also became my responsibility to keep the media informed of everything we were doing. So I became the public information officer for my agency, scheduling media interviews, sending out press releases, all of those things. So looking back on my 20-year law enforcement career, Dwight, I got into it to help people. And I didn't realize that that would look like communication. I didn't realize that was kind of my superpower, but everything that I did for the police department was communication focused. Teaching DARE, talking to the media, hostage negotiation, all of that was communication focused. And so I knew when I signed on to the police department at 23 years of age that I was signing on under a 20-year hazardous duty retirement. So I could retire at the age of 43. There was nothing requiring it, but that was the first I would be eligible to retire. It's 25 years now, but I was grandfathered into that. It became 25 about 10 years ago. So I knew at 43 that I wasn't going to sit at home. I had kids who would be in college and starting college at that point, and I just knew I wasn't going to sit at home. So I knew I needed a second gig. And the pension is great, but the pension is not to support the family. It provides benefits and things like that. It's not enough to live off of, so to speak. So around 2010, I started speaking professionally at some conferences that I was already attending, and I kind of stumbled into it, if you will, Dwight. I was asked by a friend of mine who was organizing the conference about a month ahead of before the conference was to start. She called me and she said, I just had one of my breakout speakers have to cancel. She says, do you have anything you could fill that time slot with? And I was like, well, it was 2010. I was researching bullying at the time because bullying was a huge issue in the school, still is, but that's when it was kind of becoming a big issue. And so I had been researching it for my DARE classes. And I said, I've been researching bullying. I could probably talk about that. So she said, that'd be great. You'd save me a ton of heartbreak if you could just fill that time slot. So I did. And in my breakout session was about a dozen high school principals, school resource officers, people like that. And after my breakout session, they started coming up to me saying, hey, would you come and train our staff, our teachers, about what you just told us? And I said, I can. I mean, you'd have to pay for my gas. Like, I didn't really know how this whole speaking thing worked. Like, you'd have to cover my expenses for me to do that. And they're like, we would love to do that. So I came and spoke to the couple of school staffs around the state. And those schools were like, hey, would you come back and do an assembly for our students? Then I'm like, well, you're going to have to pay me for my time. And they're like, we're happy to do that. And that just kind of started the speaking career that when I did those assemblies, when I did those presentations, it wasn't work. It was what I feel 100% what I was created to do. And I remember, Dwight, looking back on the middle school days for me, I remember when people came in and did school assemblies thinking to myself at 13 years old, wouldn't that be cool? Like, what a cool job that would be to go and do these assemblies, get on stages and speak. But the 13-year-old in me didn't have any cool stories. You know, I hadn't hiked Mount Everest. I hadn't survived cancer. I have all 4 of my limbs intact. I didn't think that that was a job for me. And then 20 years of law enforcement provided the stories that bring the takeaways, that bring the content, that make my speeches and my presentations memorable. So I really feel like I was kind of, the curtain was pulled back for me in middle school and said, kind of, this is what you could be doing or what you will be doing. And then it took about 30 years from the middle school days before that really kind of came to fruition. So today I retired from law enforcement in 2018 and after 20 years of service. And the nice thing was, as my retirement date got closer, I wasn't running from law enforcement. I liked the job. I liked what I was doing. I was teaching almost every day. I was supervising school resource officers who were assigned to the schools. So I was involved with schools a ton. I wasn't running from that. I was running to the business that was already up and running and keeping me very, very busy. I was using vacation days at that time to travel the country and do these presentations. So not having to take vacation anymore to be able to go out and make that full time. When I retired, I added a podcast, I added mastermind facilitation, I added one-on-one coaching, I added all of those things that I just didn't have the time to do when I was managing both jobs. So that's kind of me in a nutshell from birth to today. So I know I left some things out, but feel free to ask what you need clarification for.
Yeah, you've accomplished a tremendous amount. One of the things that I take notes as you're probably watching.
Mm-hmm.
I like the fact that you talked about you graduated and you didn't go to jail. I joke about that because what I really caught though is you choose to stay out. You choose to stay out of that type of atmosphere or that lifestyle or that angst. It doesn't mean that you were perfect in high school.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you weren't a person that did some things that, maybe you weren't proud of or whatever the case may be. But people listening or watching, you need to choose, right? In life, you make choices.
Yeah.
And that was a choice that you brought up in our conversation here. That is powerful because everybody makes excuses. And I always say you have excuses or success. You can't have both, right? Mm-hmm. You choose to move your life forward. And I like the fact too, that you took the path of going into school, knowing full well that you had this dead zone between you being able to do what you wanted to do, what you were interested in. But instead of sitting back, what do most people do? Majority of the population is going to sit and go, well, that's unfair. Instead of doing something to make it fair,
right,
for you.
Right.
It isn't society's job to make things fair for us. It's for us to figure out and navigate society to make things fair for us based on what effort and how resilient are you. So congrats on that. I like that fact that you minored in Spanish and you could mumble through conversations with them not being able necessarily to speak English, you being able to speak Spanish, but you cared enough because even if it was a stepping stone in a career, you still cared enough to put yourself through learning another language. Because I have tried learning another language. It's not easy, contrary to what people say. So I connect with your story because you're about serving others. You're about getting better. You're about doing things to proceed and move life forward, all the way from you talking about being that hostage negotiator. And as you said, really a lot of times it might have been just somebody in a crisis, and
Mhm.
you learned all these skills to communicate. So you're always serving. You're always looking at being that person that's, protecting, which is what
Mm.
police do. But that was, I feel that that was from your young age in your DNA, right?
Yeah.
To want to serve and to protect and to help.
Yeah, and you could make an argument that being the middle child, like I was the peacekeeper in the family. Like I was always negotiating deals between my brothers, negotiating a deal between mom and this brother and that kind of stuff. And so I feel like I got a lot of experience with that growing up. And it's interesting you bring up the word choice. That's a big deal for me. I don't choose what happens to me. I choose how I react to it. But I also recognize patterns. Like my dad's dad left my grandma when she had 5 kids and went off with somebody else. My dad left my mom with 3 kids and went off with somebody else. Like I saw a pattern developing. And so I guess the pendulum for me swung so far back the other way, Dwight, that in college, if I went out on a date with a girl, like I couldn't go out with girl B until I knew that girl A was not going to go anywhere. You know what I mean? Like I couldn't, if there was going to be a second date for us, like not that I had a lot of girls lined up to date me. I don't want to make it sound that way, but my brain became very focused on the choice I was making, that when I got married, it was going to be forever, because I had seen the fallout, growing up with the fallout of people deciding or choosing not to love somebody. And I really feel it is a choice. We want to romanticize that and say, well, I fell out of love. No, you didn't. You just chose not to love them for whatever reason. And I think that that's, no fault towards people. We choose things all the time. And I just decided I was going to choose forever when that time comes, as much as it's within my control. There are people who are divorced today who had absolutely no control over that. So I will never judge those people. My mom, did a great job with the 3 boys she raised on her own. No judgment there. But I had seen a pattern developing, and I decided that when I make this choice, it's going to really, really be an important choice for me. And it's going to be something that I'm going to choose every day.
No, good for you. When, like you said, we choose for ourselves. It's like, I'm a divorced man and I raised 5 kids.
Mm-hmm.
I eventually had joint custody, eventually got full-time custody of him. And I defined my life by the fact that this is what I chose. I didn't want to be that deadbeat dad. I
For
didn't want to be
sure.
that deadbeat parent, because women do it too. There's
Yeah.
lots of women, especially in my 20 years in my career in finance and insurance. There's women that abandon their kids too. It's just more
Right.
prevalent in society that you hear about men doing it. And I didn't want to be that guy. I was
Right.
driven to want to be successful, and I had to make choices. And my choice, just as you made choices that yours is going to be forever, for me, it was going to
Mm-hmm.
be that present parent. So I appreciate that. I appreciate
Yeah.
you adding to that. I
And
also
to
like,
be fair, my dad, if I can push in here, my
yeah, go
dad
ahead.
divorced my mom, got remarried a couple of years later, is still married to that woman 40 years later. So our life isn't defined by one choice that we make. Our life is defined by the daily choices that we make. Like he made a choice to not stay in the original marriage he was in, but also chose to continue in this marriage. And they're a beautiful couple, and I love being with them. So it's, there's always room for a do-over, so to speak.
I
That
like that.
things
A
things may not have
reset.
worked out like you wanted the first time. So take what you learned and make the next one better. Be
I
better
like that.
based on the heartache that's happened to you.
That is so true. We can either we are defined by our choices. Like you said, we don't have to stick with that choice. We can move forward or we can move back. And moving forward is actually easier than staying stuck, right?
For
And being
sure.
miserable or whatever. Like you said, your dad now 40 years with somebody, and should he have stayed miserable for 40 years? And this is no slight on your mother,
No,
right?
no.
But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, this life's in session. This isn't a dress rehearsal. We have one shot to have happiness and
Yeah.
create happiness, and things happen for a reason. They don't happen to us, they happen for us. And looking forward, back then you probably couldn't get it, but today you can look back and reflect and see the goodness and and in decisions by other people. And that was their choice. They have to live with the consequence. And obviously in your dad's case, it's worked out great. So
Yeah. Yep.
good for him.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I like the fact that you went to a conference, and I've heard this happen before. Hey, will you fill in that spot? Right?
Yeah.
Will you do this? And the next thing you know, you got to pay my gas. Oh, now you got to pay for my time. The escalation of your speaking career starting makes me smile, because you chose to accept it and grab it and be grateful for it and move forward. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know how much, were you fearful at all when you were doing that? Or is it just because you were so much into communication as a hostage negotiator and the work you had done with DARE? Was it an easy transition, or did you struggle at all with your getting into it?
It was a relatively easy transition because I was teaching DARE classes pretty much all day, every day. A typical DARE day for me was 4 to 5 45-minute lessons in a day. And it's the same session 4 to 5 times that day. And then the next week you come to that school again, you do another 4 to 5 sessions in the same day of the next lesson. Kids rotate through you, or you rotate through the classrooms. But I say that to say I was already speaking. I was already dealing with 5th graders and 7th graders all day, every day, which I really do enjoy those kids. And honestly, it was more of a conversation than it was a lecture, because that's how kids learn most effectively, as you get involved in the learning. So it was more an art than a science. It was a conversation that would ebb and flow. If I didn't get the responses I needed, I had to ask better questions. So it was training ground for what I do today as a speaker and a communication coach. And I speak a lot to businesses and organizations today. And one of the things they ask me is like, well, we need to make sure you're entertaining. And I'm like, listen, if I can keep the attention of 1,000 middle schoolers crammed in a gym, set on bleachers for an hour, and have it quiet as it can be in there, your boardroom does not scare me. Like, it just doesn't. I'm used to changing topics. I'm used to changing tactics. I'm used to showing videos, to jumping around, to changing the modulation of my voice, to dropping in a story that seems random until I finish the story, and then it winds everything together. That's what you have to do with kids who are used to watching 3 to 5 minute YouTube videos. So I got to train DARE officers as well for about 6 or 8 years. They would come from all over the country to Kentucky. We would train them. And I would tell them, I'm like, you can know the curriculum forwards and backwards, but if you don't present it in a way they're going to remember it, you have actually done them no good. You have to make sure you have to connect. And that's the hard part for some police officers, Dwight, that those police officers who are the Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am, very detached, very unemotional, because that's how we're trained. That can work on the street. That doesn't work in the classroom. We always told them, you've got to lift that badge up and let those kids see your heart. You've got to let them see that you're a mom or a dad or a friend or whatever who happens to wear a police uniform for a living, because that's how you help people.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you're talking about connection and storytelling and being able to start a story and wind it back up to having the punchline, or whatever you want to call it, not necessarily punchline, but having that aha moment for people.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to add, though, is you talked about that's how you have to speak to, grade 7, grade 8. Well, I want to add, though, I think for a lot of adults, they need to be spoken that way, because their attention span is like a mosquito farting. It's
for
just,
sure.
It's done. Right.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, I think that prepared you to obviously connect, but it also made it so that you weren't so high level. Because I hear some speakers, they talk way above people's heads, or they've got no energy. They're not. You got to give to the audience, and you got to be relatable through storytelling, and that roller coaster ride to where you get at the end and you satiate them with an aha moment. I think by you doing that, you've made your adult speaking career that much more worthwhile, right? For the person that's going to attend and hear you speak. Just listening to you speak on the podcast, your tonality, your energy, those watching will understand what I'm talking about. Those listening, go check it out on YouTube. Scott, you've got it, brother. I appreciate you.
Well, thank you. And, for the listeners and the watchers that are out there, like, they attend conferences too. they know where the bar is in the speaking world. It's pretty low, unfortunately,
Oh, it is
which means
terrible.
you just have to be slightly better than the average speaker to get repeat business. And so I don't want to be just slightly better. I want to be way better. I want to be easier
That's
to work
awesome.
with. I want to be low maintenance. Like, I don't care what color the M&Ms are in the green room. I really don't care, right? Just let me have some water and a microphone and I'm good, right? I'm pretty low maintenance, low drag. Because as you know, when I live in a house full of women, one of us has to be low maintenance. It just happens to be me, right? I'll be ready in 5 minutes. You let me know when I've got 5 minutes before you're ready, and then I'll start getting ready. So I just believe I want to be super easy to work with. I want to be super relatable to people. I want to tie it to an emotion, because that's how you make sure people remember it, is you tie it to an emotion. And I'm going to weave a bunch of stories in there. Dwight, we have learned and we have taught the next generation with stories since before there was written word. We started writing those stories down in caves before they became words on a page. And I just think story is the way you teach, and that's the way people remember it. And if I use a keynote, I've got pictures up there of everyday objects that will remind them of the story we shared, so that when they see that object in the real world, they're going to remember that story we talked about.
Oh, that connection. That's a
Yeah.
great idea, right? Obviously, like I said, I've been a captive speaker, so I go and have PowerPoints, and there'd be a presentation, and there'd be a picture of somebody pulling their hair out because we were talking about finance stuff, or we were talking about, there'd be a picture of, a medal, you could win stuff, or whatever the case may be. But that visual that you're talking about, just having that, so that when they're walking somewhere and they see that same object and it ties it back to you. I never thought about that. So I appreciate that connection, that thought.
Yeah.
I'm going to take that more serious now. I
Yeah.
didn't think about that. So that you're so correct, because we're not everybody is, but a lot of us, majority of the population are more visual than they realize.
For sure.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's a great way for a person to make sure that they have the biggest impact on the people that have just given their time to come and listen to you. So that's a great feed.
Yeah. And the frustrating thing for me early on, Dwight, and when I got into speaking, was I felt like I was building sandcastles. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Like, I would do all this work. I would create this presentation. I would go and present it. I would stand back. I'm like, that's exactly what I wanted. And I would admire the work. I'd be like, I like that a lot. And then I know people would leave the event, time would move through, the waves would come in and start washing that sandcastle from their memory. They couldn't remember the things that we talked about. And the quote that they won't remember what you say, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. That's a Maya Angelou quote that I love. So make them feel something, they'll retain it longer, tie it to a visual reminder, and that will keep coming up for them and keep reminding them of that presentation. And it makes the sandcastle last a little bit longer.
I love that. That's a great analogy. Listeners are wanting to listen to that again. The idea of the sandcastle washing away, because really throughout my life, I've been to over 300 different events. I've heard so many speakers in my industry. Prior to being in finance, I own a consulting firm, a computer consulting IT firm. So I've been to so many conferences, and yes, taking notes helps, but it's still, sometimes you get so enthralled in listening, you don't necessarily write notes, and you leave, and I'll be at a table with people. You might go out for drinks or a meal, and you'll talk about, remember what Scott said? And you're all sitting there trying to piece together what Scott said. But if you had that more anchoring position like you utilize, it'd make it so much more easier, not just necessarily seeing a visual and having it pop into your head. But we just, as speakers, we need to ensure that it's more than that 5 to 10% they say that sticks. Right. The higher we can get, the more value we've given people for them to climb in life and serve them. So I love that.
For sure. Yeah.
So one of the things that, you talked about the hostage negotiator. And this may sound like a silly question, but it was something that, and I find when something pops into my head and I put it down and we ask it, the worst worst you can do is say no or chuckle at it. What would be a misconception in society today due to TV and movies regarding a hostage negotiator and what they do for a living?
That's a great question. And I hate to burst a lot of people's bubbles, but contrary to listening to me up to this point, the best hostage negotiators are not the best talkers. Let me tell you what I mean by that. We would have officers that would apply when we would have an opening on the hostage negotiation team, because we were a 3-person unit. So when we had an opening, officers would apply, we would do interviews, and they would say things like, I'm a really good talker. Like I can sell ice to an Eskimo, all the things that people say, like I'm a great talker. And I'm like, that's cool to an extent. But Dwight, I've never talked somebody into doing something. I have listened people into doing something more successfully, meaning as a hostage negotiator, as a human, we have to be better at asking questions. Because when we ask good questions, we will learn from the people we're sitting with best ways to solve their problems. The person that I'm on the phone with as a negotiator has a serious problem. They know it. I know it. They're trapped in a place they didn't want to get trapped in. The police have them surrounded. They're probably going to jail. They know this. So what's the best way they can get out of this situation? They want out. So they have a need. But there's a lot of things that got them to the point where they are stuck in a building surrounded by the police. And so as we have these conversations, we start to learn about, maybe they lost their job. Maybe they had gotten to a point where they could no longer provide for their kids. They thought robbing this store would provide a quick income. There's insurance to cover the money that the store loses. Whatever the backstory is, like there's a reason we got here today, right? Maybe at the end of the day, the guy I'm talking to can't stand to see his kids see him as a failure. And he's not providing for his family the way he wants. I say he because almost all hostage takers are male. It's almost an exclusive area that we dominate, right? Yay, us. We get into situations where we make poor choices and we don't know how to get out of them. So, as I'm talking to this guy, it's clear to me like he loves his kids, right? And so that's something that I can use. And I say use, it sounds manipulative. I want him to come out safe. I want anybody that's in there with him to be safe. And I want my officers to be safe. And if I accomplish my goals, that's his best chance of succeeding. So maybe I say something like, I understand why you're here. Like your kids mean a lot to you. I want your kids to still have a relationship with you. I want them to still be able to talk to you. I want them to still know that their dad made some poor choices, but once he realized it, he did his best to fix it. And so that maybe they were suicidal up to that point. They didn't care if they got out of this or not. And now we start reminding them of their why. And it doesn't have to be a hostage negotiation situation, Dwight. If one of my customers calls me and they're mad about something, because let's be honest, they usually call when they're mad. They don't call to tell me that they love my product and they're just telling all their friends about it. They call when something's not working. And so when I start listening to them and finding out how did we get here, what do they need this to do that it's not doing, and then we start framing it back to them as a way we can solve this to where they're still accomplishing their goals. That's what a good negotiator does. I get people to do what I need them to do because I've listened to them long enough to say, this is the best solution to your problem. And I've just got to get you there. And I've got to get you to have some ownership of it so that you feel like you've kind of arrived at this solution along with me. And I don't even have to have the credit. So I feel like to burst everybody's bubble on what makes a good negotiator is a really good listener. And that is a superpower today that a lot of people don't have. And I'll be honest with you, in a normal situation, Dwight, I struggle with it. I'm easily distracted, like somebody drives by or there's noise outside. Like I'm a distractible person. And so I really have to focus when I'm in an important conversation to focus my brain, to make sure I'm listening, to pick up all the things they're saying. And sometimes more importantly, what are they not saying? What are they avoiding talking about? What is something that clearly they're not comfortable with? Those are the things that once we kind of understand those from their perspective, we're in a better position to help them.
Now, I like how you talk about the fact that a superpower is listening. And the reason I bring that up, I was on a podcast myself as a guest. This might have been about a year ago. And one of the things they asked me is, if you were to talk to your 18, 19-year-old self, what would you tell them? Right? Based on your
Mm-hmm.
experience today. And my answer was, I'd tell myself at that age to listen,
Yeah.
be a good listener,
Yeah.
because oh man, we're a lot alike, brother. I get distracted easy too.
Yeah.
And I do. So I'm a working project the rest of my life till I take my last breath.
Mm-hmm.
And being present is the biggest reason people don't know how to listen. They're always looking to respond. They're always looking to interject their opinion, and they're not truly present in the conversation. And I don't know about you, but I know with me, podcasting has taught me to be that much better of a listener,
Yeah.
because as I mentioned earlier, you've given me an hour of your life, time you'll
Mm-hmm.
never get back. And to me, I take that very seriously and I'm very appreciative of it. So I want to listen and I want
Mm.
to understand. And that's why I take notes, because things can be missed so quickly.
Yeah.
And those listening or watching, it's a practice thing, it's a skill. Being
Oh,
that
for
person
sure.
that's not easily distracted and listen and be present in the conversation. Like you hear about this all the time, Scott, where people talk about, you know, oh, I had this conversation with such and such. It was just fabulous. And
Mm.
I'll talk to that other person and they'll say, well, I hardly said anything. I just listened.
Yeah. Yeah.
Big light bulb, big bells going off, because
Yeah.
people want to be felt like they're heard, that you
Yes.
care enough to listen. It doesn't mean that you can't have a conversation where you interject, but interject when it makes sense. Are you there to be present and serve that person, whether they're your client, your family member? I know as me as a parent, I've become a better parent from the oldest down to the youngest through the 5 kids, because I started listening more instead of trying to fix things which didn't need fixing because they didn't want it fixed. They just wanted to vent. I learned to be
Right.
a better listener. And then all of a sudden, oh, my dad's a superhero, or my dad, their friends would go, oh, we wish you had your dad. Whereas
Yeah.
inside, I'd listen to what they're saying, and inside, I'm screaming, going, I want to tell you how to fix it.
Yeah.
Or I
Yeah.
feel that with my clients, sometimes with my clients, because I get a lot of that barbershop conversation, hairdresser, bartender, where you're telling you stuff. They don't want to know what your opinion is. They don't want to
Right.
know your resolve of how to fix it. They just want you to listen. So I had
Yes.
to learn to keep that inside and let it, instead of it coming out.
Yes. And if we rush to the fixed, Dwight, if we start with a mindset, I'm going to fix this, we'll start fixing the first few things they say, and those are not the problems. The first few sentences out of most people's mouth in a crisis is not their problem. And so we could start trying to solve things that aren't really the problem. We've got to get to the root of the problem, and we only get there if we keep them talking. If we keep asking good follow-up questions, kick them to higher levels of thinking and things like that, that's how we get to the root problem, where we could have saved ourselves a ton of time if we'd have just listened longer before we start fixing. Eventually, we'll get to a point where we're fixing, but that comes after we've established rapport. We've got to establish rapport in order to really help people. And that was my main job as a negotiator, was to establish rapport. Start building a relationship with this person where they start to trust me. They start to know, like, and trust me. And that's how we do business today. We do business at the speed of rapport. People will only
I
do
like
business
that.
with people they like, know, and trust. And so the more you can get them talking, the more you can be a good listener, the more they will start to like, know, and trust you. I tell people all the time, because people come to me for communication coaching and they say, well, I'm really not good at small talk. I hate small talk, so I shy away at events. I get on my phone. I stay away from people at conferences during breaks. And I'm like, this is an easy fix. Here's what you do. Because they're like, I don't know what to say. Ask them questions. Ask them what they do. Tell me about your family. How'd you end up at this conference? What's the best thing that happened to you this week? And you may only have 5 minutes to talk to that person, and they may have talked 95% of the time. But to your point, they will go back to their seat thinking, I really like that person, because you let them talk about their favorite subject, which is themselves. That's what we all love to talk about. And you had maybe 5 sentences that you said, and all of them ended with a question mark. And so you have built rapport with them because you were a good listener and you allowed them to talk about themselves.
And really, there's asking questions. You can learn, like listening to my podcast back, which I always do. I learned from what questions the podcast guests will ask or that I have asked and how it was respond. Like I learned, it's like a coach looking at their game day film of what they've done. So I know myself, I don't know about you, but I always work at what questions I'm going to ask, but they're always similar in nature. There's not like I have a Rolodex or a big book of questions. They're all a regurgitation of asking a question back. They might share something and just ask from within their answer. And you can go on and on and on. And like you said, you might say 10 sentences, 5 sentences, and the rest's all about them. And if you really get to know them, the next time you come to an event, like I've gone to so many events and all of a sudden you see people across the room, or I'll see them and I'm waving because I've been that person to them, or they might have been the reverse to me and they're waving and coming over and I feel that gladness. And it sounds kind of corny, but it's like, hey, I remember that guy. They're happy to see me. Look at the smile on their face. Before they even reach me, my energy level's just gone right up.
Yes. Right? You feel known. And that's what we all want to do, is we want to feel known. And there are people out there, Dwight, right now doubting us. They're like, it's not that easy. Here's a fun experiment to see if it's that easy. Next time you're at the coffee shop or at the restaurant or something, look at the person's name tag and call them by name. When you walk up to the barista at the coffee shop, maybe her name is Joni, and you say, hey, Joni, how are you? And she'll take her, so she'll be like, I'm good. How are you? And then sometimes they're like, do I know you? I'm like, no, I read your name tag. We love hearing our own name. We love when people take the time to call us by name. And so the more you do that, you'll get a different interaction with people when you start using their name. Now I say that, but I'm also terrible at retaining names. Oh, so I have to work on that. And my wife and I have this standing rule, Dwight, where if somebody comes up and starts talking to me and I don't introduce her in the first 10 seconds or so, that's her cue to introduce herself. Because like, I'll know this person, I'll know their family, I'll know all about them, but their name is not registering with me. So when she says, hey, I'm Greta, they're like, I'm John. I'm like, you're right, John, Greta, John. I should have introduced you. Sorry. Like, I just learned their name at the same time she did. Like, I know the person.
I do the same thing.
Name. So
I taught my kids that even when they were little. The parents would come up from the schools. We would be at different events or their extracurricular stuff. The moms would come over because I was the dance dad, taking them to different things. And I did that to my kids. I taught them. I laugh because there's nothing wrong with that. If you're a person that's, and I'm not trying to, have that you made it that way that you're not good at names. Right. I just haven't been. So why not use little cues like that you do with your wife, or I use my kids or friends now? That's awesome. I love
I'm not offended when somebody doesn't remember my name, but we think because we don't know somebody's name, like it's going to be really awkward if we ask it. Sometimes, they'll say, I'm having trouble with your name. I'm like, it's Scott. And they're like, that's right, Scott. And we blow right past it. It's not a big deal. I have spent a lot of years telling my teenage daughters, it's only awkward if you make it awkward. If you just say, quite honestly, your name has escaped me right now, they'll tell you your name and you can move right past it and neither person is offended. But if you have an hour-long conversation with them the whole time trying to remember their name, after that hour, it is awkward to ask them their name. It is. So if you don't remember it in the beginning, ask them in the beginning, it's less awkward. So
absolutely. Within the first 20 seconds. Yeah, within the first 20 seconds, I'll say, you know what? I recognize your face. Yes. Right. I recognize who you are, but your name escapes me. Will you do me a favor? And I'll say those words. Will you do me a favor and just remind me your name?
Yes.
And you know what? A lot of times, listeners, people watching, they'll go, you know what? I can't remember yours either. I'm Scott. I'm Dwight. And you have you give a chuckle over it, and it breaks the ice. And now the conversation is just amazing. And those listening don't think it's hard, because it's not.
Correct.
The other person most likely doesn't know who you are anymore either, even though they recognize your beautiful face.
Yes. And a lot of times, Dwight, I'll throw in an extra when you're like, I'm Dwight, I'm Scott. I'm like, Dwight, thank you. There's no guarantee I'm going to remember that by the end of this conversation, but I know it right now. Like I will tell people that because that's just how it is, man. And we're not offended. We can make any situation awkward if we dance around what we're afraid to talk about.
Oh, it absolutely is. Like I'm a God-fearing man, and God has blessed us with the ability not to be perfect. And other people we're talking to, they aren't perfect either. And sometimes lack of perfection likes meeting lack of perfection. And then you chuckle over it, you move forward. And by you saying, you know what, I might not remember it at the end, you just made it relatable, because they're thinking, I like this dude. I'm going to be the same damn way.
Yeah. Right? And they're thinking to themselves, that's good, because I already forgot your name again. Like I said it, they said theirs, and they've forgotten my name again. So I tell people all the time,
repeat the name a lot can help.
For sure. And if somebody calls you by the wrong name, correct them quickly so that they don't continue calling you by the wrong name, because it's more embarrassing for them to find out later that they were calling you by the wrong name.
And they'll avoid you.
Yeah.
Then it is for you to after the fact.
Hey, it's Scott. I get Steve Harvey all the time. My name is Scott Harvey. Steve is my more famous brother, has a cooler mustache. That's what I tell people when they call me Steve. I'm like, he's my more famous brother with a cool mustache. Other than that, we're the same person. So that's my running joke. So people call me Steve all the time. And I will just simply say, it's Scott. And they're like, of course it is. I'm so sorry. No big deal. Not a big deal. And I spoke at a conference one time, Dwight, and I made the program as Steve Harvey, right? And I took the stage and I told the audience, I can only imagine your disappointment when you thought Steve Harvey was going to be speaking, and out comes some guy named Scott Harvey, different person altogether. And the conference promoter was embarrassed, and she's telling me backstage, she goes, I'm so sorry that happened. This is super embarrassing. So I looked at her, I said, whose name is on the check? And she opens up the envelope. She goes, Scott Harvey. I said, then we're good. I don't really care what name is the program, right? I can't cash Steve Harvey's checks.
Yeah, you're honest though. And you took something that could be, some people would be a-holes about and jerks about it, and you just pivoted it. Because you know what? We're back to the fact we're human, right?
Yes. Yep.
We're not perfect. We make mistakes. But I will say this, people listening or watching, if you make a mistake, own it. Yes. Own that mistake. Don't hide from that mistake. Just be a person that can just say, you know what, I'm sorry for that. Mm-hmm. I'll do better next time. Or you don't even have to say that. Just prove that you're going to do better next time. I get people calling me Dwayne all the time. All the time. Yeah. I've gone to different, and my last name's Heck. You know how many people it's just like it sounds. Like you read it, like you hear every single day in media, you read in print. My name is said, literally, when I looked it up, it said they figure the Heck is used as a slang millions of times a minute, not a day, a minute.
Yeah.
Whatever. I don't care. Yeah. Like I get people making fun of me even in my 50s. The little funny names. Oh, the heck. Oh, yeah. You've probably heard all that. Yeah, I have.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. It's the name of my podcast, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll tell people, don't be sorry. That's okay. Like, everybody's got to have, if it made you smile, I'm okay with that.
That's right.
Makes you smirk, makes you do whatever. Just like people having the last name of Smith. I know people that do, and they got bugged their whole lives.
Right.
Whatever. Use it instead of using it as something that causes animosity between your 6 inches or stress or anxiety. Use it as something that you can embrace that makes you unique, because you are unique, right? Just like you being Steve Harvey.
That's right.
I love it. So Scott, you help entrepreneurs and business leaders to grow their business without sacrificing their family or their health. Mm-hmm. What do you teach specifically to assist in the balance of work, health, and family life?
That's a good question. And that's something I'm still working on every day. When I retired from the police department, my office is now what used to be a bedroom in our house. This is my work from home office. And so the challenge for me is I'm never not at work. So even when I'm sitting on the couch with my family, I'm a huge extrovert. So I'm on social media, surfing around. When we're having a conversation or something, sometimes I'm on my phone also. And in the back of my mind, I think that's work because I'm connecting with people, I'm serving my audience, all of those things. So it has to be a conscious decision on my part to say, we're going to have this time where I'm not going to be at work. So some of the things that I miss from being my police department days, and it took me a while to figure this out, was I'd get up in the morning, I'd get ready, and I would put on a uniform, complete with the Batman belt, the bulletproof vest, everything. And I would drive physically to work. So during that time of transformation, of putting on my superhero outfit, I was getting in the mindset of policing. And when I would drive home from the police department and come inside and change out of that superhero outfit, my brain was rewiring to home, to dad, to husband, to all of the other things that I do here at home. Now that I work from home, I have to build those things in. I have to decide when I leave this office and I walk out this office door, the transition has to happen quicker because I don't have a drive home. I don't have a superhero uniform that I'm changing out of. I have to make that transition differently. During the pandemic, we all struggled with this. Like if I get up and get on a Zoom call in my pajamas, am I really in work mode? Or am I still I'm in bed mode? And John Acuff, who I'm a huge fan of, he did a whole thing about during the pandemic. He said, put on pants. Put on pants because you've never done your best work in your pajamas. Put on a pair of nice pants because that tells your brain you're going to work. Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, which if you all haven't read The War of Art, you need to read that book. He's a writer, and he says every day when he goes out to where he does his writing, which is just an outbuilding on his property, he says, I put on work boots. He said, because I remind myself, this is my work. This is what some people dig a ditch. I write books. And I put on my work boots to remind me I'm going to work. And so I think we need those things. And we also need to give our families permission to call us on the times when we're not honoring that. When we do get sidetracked, when we do get to a point where we're broken that barrier between family time and work time. Now, there are times where I get phone calls from clients that are in off hours. But I've also trained my clients that that's the exception, not the rule. So my family is more forgiving of me when I take those calls because there's a good chance it's an emergency. Or if I text a client a question or ask them something or an article that I found, I put no time limits on them replying, even if they don't, because maybe it's an off hour for them. So I just send it out there to give them content, to give them information. And if they don't get back with me until the next day, I'm okay with it. I hope you were doing something fun with your family. Like I don't put time parameters on my replies to people. And a lot of times, if it's an email that I'm working on at the end of the day, I'll schedule it to go out the next morning because I don't want somebody to have to get this once they got home from their workday. So those are the things that we can work into our normal schedule. I tell business owners all the time, the telephone that we carry all the time makes us think everybody is thinking work all the time. As business owners and entrepreneurs, a lot of times we are. Your employees are not. So I tell them to set a reminder in your phone. I have an iPhone. So it's as easy as, hey, Siri, when I get to the office tomorrow, remind me to talk to Jonathan about this problem. And then when I get to the office, just like magic, Siri knows where I work and she reminds me to talk to Jonathan. I walk up to Jonathan that morning. I say, hey, Jonathan, I thought of this last night, but I didn't want to bother you while you were with your family. So now that we're at work, tell me about what happened yesterday. Because that tells Jonathan, hey, I don't want to bother you during your family time. I know this is important to you. And so I just made sure we talked about this during business hours.
It brought you closer though, too.
Yeah. And I didn't have to remember it because I won't remember it. I set a voice memo to remind me later to do something, which I do all the time.
I love it. People listening, you need to rewind that. There were so many nuggets of great information there that it's simplistic though, but you need to actually listen to it and then apply it. And for some of you that have never ever done what Scott's talking about, it's all possible. It just takes some effort. And Scott uses technology, which I use my iPhone too for you know what? You don't have to be the memory God, the person that can
Mhm.
remember everything that's going on. You don't have to be that person that, defines your life inside of a box. Meaning Scott said, well, my family understands if I do take something during that time where they're allowed to connect to me and allowed to, reach out to me, that it is that important. So you can, and my point is you can be flexible in life, but
Mm.
stick to your core values. For me, my core values, Scott, are faith, family, and work. They have been since I was a young man for
Mhm.
30 plus years. But that doesn't mean that sometimes, people listening, we look for answers, or we're looking for, well, if you're a person that's God fearing, if you're not, that's okay too. But for me, I'll pray. I'm looking for an answer or resolve. And
Mhm.
that answer doesn't always come in our fixed time frame of family,
Right.
work, or whatever. So sometimes in your work stuff, your family needs to reach you. So you need to
Yeah,
be flexible. You need to be able to be malleable into certain circumstances to understand that rigidity can be good, but it is the death of consistent connection with those things that you believe in life, work,
for
family,
sure.
faith, whatever the case may be. So I love how you utilize your iPhone, and you have no time expectations. I want to have that conversation with you, because you look at today, people text somebody and they expect a response immediately. And I used to be that person when texting first was getting into the norm. It would be
Mhm.
like, people, you're texting me and I text you back, and then they don't respond to me answering their question. Well, guess what? Their life isn't in a bubble called a text.
Right.
Their
Right.
life is in motion. It's fluid. It's going like a river. It's going all over the place, and so is yours. So
Mhm.
I never have the expectation. And I had one of my daughters who's a nurse, tell me one time, Dad, I know it bothers you when you text me and you don't hear from me for a few days, but here's what's going on. And this was
Mhm.
especially during the pandemic. I was worried about her. She was working in a COVID unit, watching
Mhm.
people pass all the time. It was very hard
Yeah,
on her. She said, sometimes
sure.
I just couldn't talk to you. I just
Yep.
couldn't be that. Even though you'd listen to me, she shut herself down. So I had to learn and get reminded by my daughter that nobody has the right to expect a response via a text, an email, a voicemail message, whatever the case may be. Always
Right.
put yourself in that person's position and think, what are they going through?
Yeah.
What is their circumstances? So what do you think about that? Like you
I
mentioned a little bit, but I'd like you
yeah.
to talk more about it.
I think we cause a lot of issues when we assume motivation. Let me explain what I mean by that. Like you said, I text my daughter and she doesn't get back with me. I will start assuming a motivation for that. Maybe she's mad at me. Maybe she's sick. Maybe, all these things. Maybe she just saw my text while she was driving and said, I'll reply to him later. And then later there was 5 other texts, 10 other emails, and life got busy and she just forgot. But when I start assuming motivation, the guy that cuts me off in traffic, I could get mad. I could ride his bumper. I could do all sorts of things. I could cut him off at the next opportunity. Or I could say, maybe that guy's late for his kid's ball game that he promised him he would make that day. And he's trying to do the right thing. And you know what? You go ahead. I hope you get to where you're going. When I assume a motivation is when I start causing problems for myself, because here's the dangerous thing. Our brain has a reticular activating system, and our reticular activating system is a filter that keeps you focused on the things that matter. And so when I assign the guy that cut me off in traffic the label of jerk, I will find everything about him that reinforces that. His bumper sticker makes him a jerk. The kind of car he drives makes him a jerk. The way he drives it, all that stuff. Where if I just assume, he's a dad late for his kid's ball game, promised him he'd be there, then I have a new filter through which to see him. And when he decides to stop at the next yellow light instead of running through it at red, I'm like, okay, good for you. You're going to get there safely. I hope he has a great game today. I'm going to find those things that fill the narrative that I've already put in for him. And so we can decide what our reticular activating system lets through and what it doesn't. The best way to know how this thing works is when you buy a new car, Dwight, you get home and you now see that car everywhere. And it kind of makes you mad because you're like, I thought I was being original when I bought this car. Like I've never seen it anywhere. You've seen it. It just didn't make it through the filter because it wasn't important to your brain. When you bought one, invested money in it, and made that part of your identity, it's now something that makes it through the reticular activating system. And so you see it everywhere. And so we get to decide what makes it through that filter and what doesn't. And that is when we assume positive motivation for people, we will start seeing all of the things about that person that make that true, instead of all of the things that make it negative. I coached volleyball for 5 years, high school volleyball, was an assistant coach, and trying to get the girls to understand that when you decide I can't hit anymore, then you're going to miss a lot of your shots because your brain is thinking of all the times that you missed that hit. Michael Jordan missed a ton of shots, but he kept shooting because he knew he was capable of making them, and he decided not to dwell on the negative things and focus instead on the positives. And so I told them, replay in your brain the times that it works instead of the times that it doesn't. And then you will unconsciously start being more successful because your brain is looking for all the times you were successful instead of all of the times that you failed.
Yeah, that's so true. I like that you're talking about the reticulating activating system. I've read about that. I've heard famous speakers talking about it. And it's so true. Even after you get rid of that vehicle, you still see them.
Yes.
My brain,
everywhere.
like I haven't owned a family van and since my kids were younger, but I still see the specific type of van I owned, pardon me, and vehicles after the fact. All of a sudden, my brain is like attuned to them, even though I haven't had that vehicle, let's say, in 10 years.
Correct.
But I like the fact of what you talked about, though, the volleyball player and playing in our minds. People listening, being a critical thinker involves work. It involves effort. You have to do like Scott's talking about, remember that good shot that you did when volleyball. Remember that instead of saying, oh, I missed it. And that's part of the psychology of sports. So even like I'm a huge hockey fan, all of a sudden a team that was in the top of the rankings is in a slump. Well, it's in between their 6 inches, right?
Yes.
It can be caused by one player spreading it and the other players not having a strong enough resolve to understand that doesn't become their reality. Or the coach, they get rid of coaches because the chemistry of the team, it doesn't matter if it's hockey, baseball, basketball, whatever, doesn't matter. Sometimes the psychology of what we think, because our brain is a computer part of me, doesn't know the difference between a truth and a lie. So like you said, tell yourself, how many times did I do it right? And keep on telling yourself that till it becomes a habit and it's habitual, even on how you treat people. It's not even just about sports. It's, that driver you talked about cutting you off, and maybe they're off to get to a sporting event they promised their child. Like, such great analogies. You're great at sharing and connecting the thought process. So I hope listeners and people watching, you appreciate the knowledge that you're learning today from Scott. So we're getting close to wrapping this up. One of the things I really wanted to talk about is what's coming out on April 18th. I believe that's the date that I read online. It's your book. It's called Silence Kills: Communication Tactics to Speak with Confidence and Build Your Influence. What has the journey been like for you writing this book? And was it something you always wanted to do, was write a book?
It is something I always wanted to do. And the problem that I ran into is when I retired is when I started working on it. But I got about 5,000 words, Dwight, into the wrong book. Have you ever climbed a ladder and realized you get to the top and like, this isn't the wall I want to be on? Like, this isn't where I want to be. You have to climb back down. You have to move the ladder. So that was frustrating. So I put it in a digital file for a long time. And I thought about it and I kicked myself about the fact that I've let this thing go. It's not happening. And then I broke it back out one day and I thought, what do I want to write about? And what I wanted to write about was a corporate presentation that I was doing at the time that became very, very popular. And it was on communication tactics. It was using what I've learned as a hostage negotiator and a public information officer and translating those into the corporate world. Because contrary to popular belief, when a crisis strikes, and we have crises every day at work, when a crisis strikes, it's not complicated that wins the day. Because under stress, our brains can't do complicated. our brains can only do simple tasks. And so this book is me boiling that stuff down into very simple communication strategies that will work under stress or not under stress. And it's something that you practice over and over and over again so that when the stress comes, it becomes a muscle memory thing and you just do it. So once I got serious about writing the book, I sent it to a friend of mine who was working for a publisher at the time and sent my writing that I had so far. And she's like, I think we want to publish this. But before I can send it to our publishing committee, I got to know that it's ready in 90 days. And I was about 10,000 words into what I thought was going to be a 50 to 60,000 word book. And I'm like, it's not going to be ready in 90 days. And so I reached out and I hired an editor. And this editor that I hired, Dwight, set due dates for me and set all of it, mapped everything out on a checklist. Because here's what I learned from me. I'm an obliger. When you take that test, I forget which test it is, I'm an obliger, which means I'm very, very forgiving of my own deadlines. But if somebody else is counting on me, I will be there. That's just how I work, right? So when I hired this editor and she set these due dates, she's like, if you turn this chapter into me this date, while you're working on this other chapter, I can start making revisions and edits, send you this chapter back. Like she couldn't do her work until I did mine. So the fact that someone else was counting on this got this book done in about 6 months from the time I hired an editor. So about 3 months into that process, we submitted it to the editor and they accepted it. And then we were within our 90 days and got it turned in time. So the book is a way of serving more people because I can only travel and speak so much. That's a finite resource. And there are some people who can't afford to bring me in as a speaker, but can buy my book and they can get the same information they would have learned at that event through a book. And so it's also something when I do a speaking event, I can make the books available in the back of the room to take people to the next level. Hey, you liked what you heard? Here's more of that. Here's the more resources to take your communication to the next level. And the book is never, I don't have any desire to be on a bestseller list. That's not why I wrote the book. I'll be honest with you. I wrote the book to book more speaking gigs because that's what I love doing.
Well, a book is a business card.
It is really a business card. And the funny thing is, and I've talked to my wife about this, like I will talk to an HR director about bringing me in to train their company or something. And they're maybe on the fence about it, or even if they aren't, and they're like, it doesn't make sense right now. I'm like, let me send you a book. Give me an address. I'll send you a book for free. And my wife is like, well, they're not going to read that. I said, they don't have to read it because when I send you this book, it doesn't get thrown away. You put it on your desk, you put it on your shelf, something. And when somebody comes into you as an HR director and says, we got to do something about our communication around here, you're like, I know a guy. And you reach into your bookcase and you grab my book and my contact information is there and they contact me and I come out and I train their employees. So that's what I want the book to do, is create more speaking gigs, because I wasn't born to be a writer. I feel like I was born to be on stage, and that's when I'm most fully alive. Now, the challenge for the book was, can I write a book that sounds like I'm speaking from a stage, that sounds like the conversation we're having right here? And John Acuff, who I mentioned earlier, reading his book showed me that is possible, that it doesn't have to be heady. It doesn't have to be textbooky. It can be funny. It can be poignant. It can make me cry as a business book, because then I'm going to remember the content longer. So that's what I put into Silent Skills, all the stories that are going to make you laugh, make you cry, and at the end of the day, teach you a lesson that you'll remember.
So it's speaking in print. And that's
is
what you're talking about, is the fact that, like you mentioned, people coming to you're speaking and they can go buy the book, or people will have the book, it's on the shelf. It's all a trigger for us to be in people's mindset where they know, like, and trust. Even if they never read your book, you did what you said. You did what you said. So already you've won a battle most people don't understand. You make a promise, you make a commitment, follow through. You sent the book. It may never come to fruition, but you started, right? You bring that book in for a speaking situation, people can go buy it. You allow them to still hold the power of making the choice to go buy the book, right? And whether or not anybody ever reads it, you kept it simple. I agree, the same thing. The people I work with, the editor and publisher, we decided they decided, pardon me, and we decided together that it was a good thing to make it at a grade 8 level. Make it simple,
Yes.
don't make the story so complex. And just like speaking, people take people on that emotional roller coaster to where they can actually get the feels and
Yes.
connect with you. So yeah, your book is basically your speaking in print for those that are nervous. Maybe they're extremely introverted and in a shell. They don't want to come see you speak or be on a stage. You've given more people the ability to know, like, and trust Scott.
Yeah.
And that is so important, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. I love that. And it's not complicated. That wins the day.
Yes.
I wrote that down. I underlined every single word. I put a star beside it because it is true.
Yeah.
Everybody overcomplicates things. And those listening, we're not saying that we haven't gone through the hills and valleys of life, that we haven't been through the school of hard knocks. We pick ourselves up and learn and move forward, right? Because life is a series of hills and valleys, trials and tribulations, but it's also a series of a lot of happiness and success, but it takes effort. And there's people like Scott that you can reach out to that can help you, that can coach you. As you mentioned, he's got one-on-one coaching. He's got a mastermind. That is what you need in life, because nobody expects you to do it on your own. This journey of life does not have to be done on its own, and it never should have to be for you to feel that way. There is people that care and can help you. You just need to be in that mindset that I'm willing to change. I'm willing to skin my knee. I'm willing to, be uncomfortable. Right.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you doing that book.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to ask, though, is can you share one takeaway or story, a personal experience when reading your book?
Yeah, I'll share with you the most valuable thing I ever learned as a hostage negotiator. This is something, Dwight, that I use every day. And this is an illustration. This is a picture that they see in my presentation that I tie to this story. So it kind of goes full circle to what we've been talking about. In everybody's brain, Dwight, is a teeter-totter. Now, where you live, it may be called a seesaw. It's a playground piece of equipment where a child sits on both sides. So for me, it was a teeter-totter. Inside everybody's brain is a teeter-totter. And on one side of that teeter-totter is emotion, okay? On the opposite side of that teeter-totter is logic and reason. So this is important because when emotion is high, when the emotion side of the teeter-totter is high, the logic and reason side of our brain doesn't function as well. So when we are experiencing a high emotion, and that could be anger, depression, scared, whatever that high emotion is, the logic and reason part of our brain disengages. And so that's why you have made choices when you've been angry, stressed, frustrated, whatever. And the next day you're sitting there going, why in the world did I do that? Because logic and reason were not invited to the discussion. You made an emotional decision. Now, here's where this comes into play. When I was a negotiator, I never dealt with somebody who wasn't high emotion because their whole world is crumbling down if I'm on the phone with them. So emotion is high. So when I first make contact with them, they are yelling at me. They are threatening me. They are threatening my family. They're hanging up on me repeatedly. I just keep calling back. Because if you've experienced high emotion before, you know it's physically exhausting to maintain that. So by yelling, by screaming, by venting, I allow that emotion to start coming down with them. And when that emotion starts coming down, logic and reason will start to reappear. Slowly at first as emotion comes down, but it'll start reappearing. This is why, Dwight, maybe one of your kids has come home super stressed from a day at school years ago, and they're yelling and they're ranting, and you spit out a very logical solution to their problem. And they blow right past it, right? Because logic is not invited to their discussion right now. They're experiencing the emotion. And an hour later, when they've calmed down, they'll come back to you with your logical solution and claim it as their own because their subconscious brain picked it up. They just couldn't logically process it. And so when the emotion comes down, they're like, that might actually work. It wouldn't work when we were here. It will work when that emotion comes back down because logic and reason back into it. Here's the problem with policing today, in my opinion. We're trained to take emotion out, to bring logic and reason to every situation, because that's a really good way to stay alive under high stress. We have to make split-second decisions in high-stress environments. The only way to do that is to try to take emotion out of it. But that makes us the just the facts, Joe Friday, uncaring police officer that the world has grown to hate. We need to remember as police officers that emotion plays equal parts in every decision we make. And we can't take emotion completely out of it because every decision has emotions tied to it. So when we're confronted with somebody who has their teeter-totter imbalanced, especially towards the emotion side, our knee-jerk reaction is to hit them with our emotion side. They come at me yelling, by golly, I'm going to dig in. I'm going to start yelling back. That's a great way to make sure they maintain high emotion. Where if we approach it in a level, logic and reason, emotion, and we're saying things like, man, that sounds super frustrating. I'm so sorry that's happened to you. We're recognizing and acknowledging the emotion in it, but we're not getting wrapped up in with our emotions. They'll settle down quicker, and we can then start bringing logic and reason back into the equation. And every time, I've had people tell me this, they're like, every time I see a teeter-totter now, I think of that. It reminds me, and when I feel like I'm getting stressed, I'm saying to myself, I've got to bring my teeter-totter back down. I've got to rebalance my mind because I can't function in a high emotion situation for very long. So that visual, that way of approaching conflict, that way of approaching crises has helped me more ways than I can count to recognize that this person, and this is why, Dwight, I would arrest people who would threaten me. They would do whatever. They would fight with me. And I'll see them out in town the next day because I policed the same town that I lived in, and they would come up and apologize. And they would say things like, I was a really big jerk and I treated you like trash and I'm sorry. If I would have hit them with my emotion, they're not going to come and apologize to me because their brain would say that guy was a jerk. That's why you treated him that way. He deserved everything he got. But if I maintain my teeter-totter and they come back to me the next day, now they're sober. Now they've spent a night in jail possibly and had a lot of self-reflection time. And now they've come to me and say, you know what? I messed up. I made some poor choices. I'm like, we've all done that. What are we going to do from today moving forward? We can't change yesterday. If we learned something from yesterday, then it has value. What do we do moving forward? And that only happens because those were the times I was able to maintain my teeter-totter. And I don't do this perfectly. I mean, raising kids, I can tell you one time, both of my daughters were screaming at each other upstairs, and I actually screamed up our stairs, "We don't yell at each other in this house." And I sat there and I kind of chuckled to myself. I'm like, I just screamed up the stairs that we don't yell at each other. Like my teeter-totter was imbalanced. I was frustrated with how they were handling the situation, and I hit them with my high emotion teeter-totter, and it didn't help. And that's why timeouts are so effective to the parents that are listening. The timeout is not for the kid. The timeout is for us to rebalance our teeter-totter so that we don't do something under our high emotion that we can't undo. And if you're a parent like we are, Dwight, many a timeouts have ended with me apologizing to my kids.
Most
I'll go to their room.
Most parents don't know how to do it, though.
I'll go to their room where they spent their punishment and their timeout, and I'll walk in and be like, you know what? Dad didn't handle that well, and I'm sorry. And I'm going to do better next time because my teeter-totter is now rebalanced, and theirs is too. And we'll hug, and there'll be tears and whatever because we're both in a more balanced state of mind. So timeouts are super helpful. They don't happen just with our kids. They happen at work. If you're getting really frustrated after a meeting, go for a walk. Take a few minutes to rebalance your teeter-totter and tell somebody, I want to talk about this. Give me 5 minutes. I'll come find you. And then you take your 5 minutes, you walk, you listen to music, you read a book, you do whatever rebalances your teeter-totter, and then find that person and have a much more productive conversation.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that. We could have a whole podcast just based on, not just communication, but just specifically that and how to time yourself out. Because I coach people on that too. Timeouts are awesome. As an adult, I love timing myself out, and I tell other people that it's okay in a circumstance with family, friends, clients, just to say, you know what, I hear what you're saying, but right now I don't have the space for it up here.
Yep.
I need to, can we revisit this in 15 minutes? Can we revisit this afternoon? And if that person's emotional state is so high where they go, no, we need to deal with this now, I'll just say, well, actually, I'm sorry. I appreciate the fact that you need to, but I don't. And I will walk away.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
all I'm going to do is respond in kind, in an emotional way, because my logic or my ability, like you talk about the teeter-totter, is I know what my triggers are. And if I've learned to identify my body triggers, and if I feel that trigger, I know that I need to time myself out soon, or I will give an emotional response. And again, people listening, it takes practice. It's
Yeah.
it's okay. You're going to make mistakes, but like Scott talked about, own it, apologize, move on, right? It's okay to have those momentary lapses of we're not perfect, but then own it and move forward. So Scott, if you had to give our listeners one last closing message, what would you tell them in regards to giving a heck and never giving up?
I think our life is determined by the mundane, minuscule choices we make every day. There's very rarely a lightning in a bottle moment that forever changes somebody's life. It is the daily choices where I'm going to wake up and choose to love my wife. I'm going to wake up and choose to serve people today. I'm going to wake up and choose to balance my teeter-totter every day. And there's not a lot of glory in those individual, easy to make decisions. But there is a lot of glory in ending up at the end of your life exactly where you wanted to be. I read the other day about the 1 in 60 rule. I don't know if you've heard about this or not, Dwight. It really changed how I think about things. If you're flying an airplane or you're driving a ship, piloting a boat, I don't know what you do with a boat. We're going to say piloting because I don't know what it's called. Or captaining a boat, you're flying a plane. You're going to set a course for your destination. If you are 1 degree off of your course, for every mile or for every 60 miles you travel, you're 1 mile from your destination. You're 1 mile off course. So if you push this out over 1,000 miles, you could be 60 miles off course when you get there, depending upon how long it takes. 130 some miles, I think, over 1,000. 1 degree doesn't seem like a lot, but if it's 1 degree over 1 degree all the way through your destination, you can be really far off. It's easy to ignore those conversations at work because they don't seem like a big deal. Like, I don't want to make a big deal over this, but that's your 1%. And if you ignore those day after day, you're going to get further and further off course. For every 60 miles you go, you're 10 miles off of your destination. So it's the daily decisions we make that course correct, that get us back to where we're going. There's not a lot of glory in fixing that 1%, but fixing that 1% every day gets you exactly where you want to be at the end of your trip.
I'd never heard of that. That is awesome. I'm familiar with the idea of being off a degree, but I've never heard it brought up to that way and that eloquently. Like, that's perfect way to put it. I like the fact you talk about waking up, and I practice gratefulness and gratitude exercises in the morning and when I go to bed, and it's stuff like that. It's choices that we make when we wake up in the morning. Are we going to be somebody that's grateful for having a roof over our head, running water, the ability to be alive for another day, the ability to serve others? Because the more we think about that stuff, as you talk about, it's a choice. It all goes back to what we've been talking about. It's a choice. It's a choice for you to want to be the best version of you every single day. And at the end of the day, when you sit back, and if you didn't have the perfect day you wanted, then reflect on it so that you don't make those mistakes again the next day. Right.
Yeah.
And if you're powerful, I will time myself out during the day and have that conversation with myself and say, hey, I did that wrong. Now I get that teeter-totter, like you talk about, get my logic back and my emotional intelligence in sync, and then deal with it right then and there. Right. So that 1 degree doesn't happen. Right.
Exactly.
But again, people listening, I'm not saying that Scott and I are perfect. We're a working project till the day we take our last breath. The difference between us and most people in society is we're constantly working at being the best version of ourselves so that we can serve you, so that we can serve society. Because if enough of us do this, we can make a giant change in society and how they think. right? So
Yeah.
I appreciate you being on, brother. Could you do me
Yeah.
a favor and let people know what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, they can go to speakingofharvey.com is my main website. Silencekillsbook.com has a promo video about the book and all the resources there about the book. Speakingofharvey.com is kind of the home base for me and gets them plugged into all of my social medias. Send me a message if they have questions, concerns, want to talk more about this. I'd love to connect with them.
Well, that's awesome. I really appreciate you bringing on, brother. This has been a great conversation. Any last things that you'd like to say before I close off the show?
I'm thrilled that you're doing this. I'm thrilled that you're helping people just be better tomorrow than they were today. And it's not the big 180-degree turnarounds. It's the 1% course corrections along the way that make it a lot easier for us. So thanks for what you're doing, Dwight. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. So thanks so much for being on Give a Heck, Scott. I appreciate your time and sharing some of your experiences so that others too can learn it is never too late to give a heck. Thank you for taking time out of your day and listening to Give a Heck. If you find value, I'd appreciate you sharing with your friends and family so they too can learn how to live life on purpose, not by accident. So you do not miss the next episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and please also post a review. I look forward to reading your comments. This has been Dwight Heck. If you want to check out other podcast episodes or today's show notes, please check out my website, giveaheck.com. And until next time, together let us all strive to give a heck.